What's up guys, DevBird here, and today we're going to be working on our item pop-up. So right now you can pick up items, but nothing really happens when you do so, other than the fact that the item goes in inventory. But we should be notifying the player somehow that they just got an item. And so we're going to be doing an item pop-up system, pretty much the same as Breath of the Wild. So let's take a look here.
A golden bow.
You see the item pop-up start to appear here, and it's going to fade in slowly. It comes up and then it's fully opaque, and then it kind of bounces back down, and then that's it. And then we're going to have the name, we're going to have a description, and we'll have the icon here. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to have it fade in, bounce a little bit, and then just have all this information appear. And you'll press the Z again to get rid of this. Alright, so that being said, let's get started on that. Alright, so here I created our little item pop-up. So all I did was take a background, and I put two texts on it and an icon. So these are just text, item name, an item description here, and this is just a image, which will serve as the icon. So this is what this would look like as an example. But we're just going to get rid of the name and the description because we'll be setting that through code. And for the most part, this is a very heavy animation task. So let's do the animations for this. And as we said, we're just going to have this fade in and then fade out, but add a little bounce to it for a little bit extra flavor. So we're going to go to our animation. We have a bunch of stuff here. I'm just going to quickly create a folder for our link or our character, and just so it's neat. Then we're going to create another folder and call this item pop-up. And I'm going to be creating a animator controller. I'm going to be calling this item pop-up controller. And we're going to drag this into our item pop-up. And now we can go over to our animator. So go for animate window. If you don't have this, just go to window and then go to animation, then animator. Click that and this window will appear. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add a fade in and then a fade out. So we're going to click on our item pop-up, and if we go to animation, which is in the same window, animation, it's going to have this thing pop up here, and then we're just going to hit create. And then we're going to call this fade in. And we are going to create the animation for this. So I usually just like to drop this down to 12 instead of 60, so it just goes by a little slower. Alright guys, I made a slight error. So we're going to have to create a new empty object and pretty much drag our item pop-up into the empty object. And then we're going to rename this to pop-up holder. And the reason why we're doing this is because we don't want the animator to be on the object that's being animated. And the reason why that is because we can't access certain information, like the game object's active state, if the object is on the animator itself. So we want to handle the turning on and off of the item pop-up through the animator. And in order to do so, we need to migrate the animator onto a different object. And so now we can delete this animator. And so you shouldn't have an animator on the item pop-up, but you should have one on the pop-up holder. And now that we have that, we can move on. Alright, so we're going to take the item description, item name, and icon, and basically set their alpha to 0, and then we're going to fade it back in, which will make the alpha back to 1. So we're going to hit the record button, and we're going to make the description, select the color, make the alpha go to 0. We're going to go to item name, going to set the alpha to 0, same with the icon, and then also the background, which is in the item pop-up. The image here, we're going to set this to 0, but we're going to have to remember that the original value is 223 because we want the pop-up to be a little bit transparent. So we're going to set this to 0, and then we're going to go to some place like 1, or I guess it's like, 10, but so 10 frames, and we are going to set all the values back to their original state. So for this was 223, and then all the other ones was 1, so just set that there. Well, actually not 1, is 225, but So we'll set this back to 225, or 255, and then set this back to 255. And we can unclick the red button, or the red recording button, and just play it, see how that looks. That looks pretty good. So let's create a new clip and call this fade out. And this will get triggered when we hit Z again, or interaction button. We're going to set it to 12 again. So we have our fade out here, and we are going to do the same thing. And we're just going to make the... We're going to go to about halfway, because we want the animation to complete a little bit quicker. I guess this depends on what game you're trying to make, but usually people want things to go away quickly. So we're going to have the fade out to be faster for my taste personally. And we're just going to go and set all of the color values to 0. And do that for everything. Just set it all to 0. And then we're going to unclick the red recording button and play it. And that goes away pretty quickly, just the way I like it. And so we have the fade in, fade out animations complete, but we need to add the little bounce. So let's do that. Let's hit the record button again. We're going to set this item pop-up to be a little bit lower. And let's say about halfway, maybe a little bit more than halfway. We're going to make it pop up just about here. We don't want to be too extreme. So we're going to move this up a little bit. So we're going to preview this, and then we're going to set it back down to about here. We're going to play that, and that looks pretty nice. So we'll just stop recording and then go to our fade out. And then we're going to have this like move up a little bit. And so this is the original position, and then we're just going to have it up just a tiny bit. Then we're going to see how that looks, and yeah, see, just like kind of just fades out. Alright, so now if I hit my game, you can see that it kind of remains there in this like halfway state. And the reason why it's doing that is because we have preview on. We're going to unclick preview, and that will fix that. And so now we can set the pop-up to off. But there's one last thing we need to do actually. We need to set the item pop-up to be on and off when the animations start and complete. So when we start the fade in, obviously we want the object to turn on. So on the first very frame, we're going to have item pop-up to be active. And then for our fade out, we're going to have it so that it's active, and then we're going to go to the end and make it not active anymore. And that should do it. Alright, so make sure that your fade in and fade out over here, the loop time is off, because we do not want these to loop. Alright, so here we have our animator, and we need to set up a trigger, or more specifically a boolean, so that we can go from fade in to fade out, and then from fade out to exit. So what this is going to look like is we're going to need to create a new empty state, and this is going to be our default state because we can't create a condition from the entry to the default state, which means that we don't want to go immediately into fade in. We need to fade in at a specific time. So when do we need to fade in? It's when we call the fade in, basically. And so we're going to go from our default state to fade in, from our fade in to fade out, and then from our fade out to exit. And so the reason why we're going to exit is because our exit is going to bring us all the way back to our entry where we can do this all over again. So we're going to create our boolean, and we'll call this one fade in. And we're going to go over to here, this line that goes from our default state to fade in. And we're going to hit the little plus sign, and our condition is going to be fade in has to be true in order for us to fade in. And so here we're going to add the condition again, except instead of fade in be true, fade in has to be false. Alright, so once we go to fade out, we're going to immediately go to exit without any condition so that we can go straight back to our entry. Now, whether or not you want the exit time for fade in to fade out is up to you, but you definitely want no exit time from our new state or our default state to fade in. So what does the exit state mean for this part? It means that in order to go from fade in to fade out, fade in has to complete. If you have no exit time, it means that it will immediately cut from fade in to fade out when the condition is met. So, it's up to you if you want the fade in to be completed at all times, or must be completed, or maybe you want it to be cut if the player hits the interact button 2 times because they want to get it out of the way. So you should probably test for that and see what works for you. But now we have all of this set up, and that's all we need. Alright, so let's get started. And first we need to create references to our text, our image, and our animator. And so text and image are both Unity UI stuff, so we need to use using Unity Engine.UI to gain access to them. So now we can create those references, and we'll just simply say public image, nope, not like that, image, and say item icon, make public text, item description, public text, item name. Last but not least, the animator. Let's call this my anim. Alright, so we have all of the references. We just need to set it up. So let's go over to managers here. Let's go drag over our item pop-up script onto here. And let's manually set up all of these references. So we're going to go over to our pop-up holder, item pop-up, and we're going to set them to their respective stuff. So let's go over to icon, drag in the icon, drag in description, drag in the name, then drag in the animator, and just like that we have references to all of these things. So now that we have a reference to that, we need a method to set this all up. So we'll just say public void pop-up item, and we're going to need to pass through an item. So say item, and then we'll just say new item. How about that? New item, so that we don't get confused. And then we need to do item name dot text is equal to the item, or the new item dot my name. And then we're going to do this for all the other ones too. So the item description dot text is equal to new item dot my description And then the item icon dot sprite is going to be equal to new item dot my icon. So let's be happy with that. And then we also, now that what this does is it's going to set all the information on our item pop-up to the correct information. So what do we need to do now? So we also need to add the item inventory manager dot instance to our inventory, right? So we're going to say add item. We're going to add the new item. So now the new item is in our inventory. The next thing we need to do is trigger the actual animation. So let's say myAnim dot set bool. And let's go and look at what we call the bool. I'm pretty sure I called it fade in. But just to double check, we're going to go to our pop-up holder and we'll see fade in. I'm just going to double click that, hit Control and copy. Or Control C to copy. And then we're going to paste that in here just to make sure that we have the correct bool here. And then we're going to hit comma and we're going to set this to true. So we're going to set fade in to true, and it's what's going to say is it's going to be in this new state. Then see here, the condition is fade in is true, and then say, oh hey, fade in is true. So I can go over here now, and it's going to trigger fade in. And so we have all of this, we have the methods set up now. Now we have to do a little bit of some other stuff. So that's pretty much all the code we need. Well, there's actually one more little bit. So we want to be able to reference the item pop-up through our inventory manager. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create a public item pop-up. Call this item pop-up. And we're not really going to utilize this in this script, but it's going to be an easy way to access the item pop-up. So let's go over to our managers, go over to our inventory manager, and we have a item pop-up. And it's going to say none. And we're just going to drag the manager into there, and it's going to be able to reference the item pop-up that's on the manager. So let's go over to our item pickup. And so instead of doing this, what we're going to do is get rid of this line. And we're going to say inventory manager dot instance dot item pop-up dot pop-up item. So we want the method, and we're going to pass through the item, and that's all we need. Alright, let's go and test this. And what should happen is that it will pop up, but we shouldn't be able to dismiss it yet. And so you see it pop up there, and now it's going to be stuck in fade in because we haven't created a method to fade out, or to at least trigger the fade in to false. So it's going to remain on our screen, and we don't really want that. So let's go over to our item pop-up over here, and let's create a method to get rid of this. So we're going to say update if input dot get key down key code dot z. So if we press Z, what do we want to happen? We want to fade back out, right? Well, what if the item pop-up isn't even active yet? So we need to check if the item pop-up is active or not. So what we're going to need to do is say if item icon dot active self, or game object dot active self is equal to true, then we can proceed. So why are we doing this part here? Well, if the pop-up isn't active, then we don't want to do anything, because why are we dismissing something that isn't even active, basically? And we're using item icon as like pretty much a convenient convenient game object to use because basically if the item icon isn't active, then the item pop-up must also not be active. So we'll just use that for convenience sake. And then we can say, we'll basically just copy paste this part, but instead of true, we're just going to say false. Now, if we run this code, what's going to happen is we're going to trigger the fade in false immediately, because what's going to happen is our Z is both our interact and our dismiss button. And so when you have something like that happen, we're going to interact with it and then dismiss it immediately. We don't want that. So how do we remedy this problem? What we're going to have to do is we're going to have to create a buffer system. So we're very similar to our dialog system, basically the exact same thing. We're just going to create a private bool, call this buffer. And we're going to say, all the way down here, we're going to create a private enumerator. We call this buffer with a capital B. And we're basically just going to say yield return new wait for seconds. And we're going to create a very small amount of time, like let's say 1/10 of a second. And so when we call this, buffer will be true. And then when we finish the buffer, then the buffer will be false. And so now we can say if the buffer is false, then we are allowed to do all of this code. Or an alternative way to do this is you could say something like if the buffer is true, then you can just return. So those two things are the exact same, or produce the same result essentially, but only for this specific example. Alright, so if the buffer is true, then we are not allowed to access this code. And so now the last thing we need to do is we need to start the buffer. So we're going to say start coroutine. We can't call this like a normal method because it's a enumerator. So we're going to call the buffer in here. And so when we interact with the item, it's going to start the buffer, it's going to fade in, it's going to set all the references, it's going to add the item inventory, and then it will turn the buffer off, and then we press Z again, we are allowed to exit. So with all of that, we should be able to interact with all of our items. So I have 3 items here. I'm going to hit Z. Hit Z again to dismiss it, and then it goes away. Go over here. You can see here how this is all working. So it will press Z, it goes to fade in, and press Z again, goes to fade out, and then goes to exit, entry, then back to our default state. So let's go back over here, press Z, we have our item, press Z again, and now it's gone. And so that's how you do a little item pop-up system. But you might have noticed one last thing is that we are able to move while this pop-up is there. And you might not want that for your game. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But I think standard is that you're not allowed to move while you are looking at an item. So let's go over to our player movement and let us create a let's go back over to our item pop-up real quick, and then let's just create a public boolean, call this in pop-up. Then let's have it as a get and set. The reason why I do this is because it hides it in the inspector panel, so the player or another game designer can't mess with it. And so let's go over to here. It doesn't really matter where you put it, to be honest. Let's just add it at the bottom. I want to say in popup equals true, and then let's go down here, in popup equals false. So now we can go over to our player movement, and then we can say over here, we can say else if inventory manager dot instance dot popup item popup dot in popup. If that's true, then we are going to be frozen. Well, maybe we should rename this to frozen to make it more clear. Okay, so you don't have to do that, but just makes it more clear what this is, basically. So now let's go over to our chest, and I'm gonna hit my arrow keys. I cannot move anymore. I have to dismiss this, and now I can move again. And that about does it for this episode. You notice that I could hit this and you see me running in place. Simply, when you interact with something, you can just have it so that you manually set your player to idle. That's a pretty quick fix. I'm not going to do that because it's so simple, but it also could be, you know, a little bit of flavor that your character like runs in place when you interact with stuff. That's up to you. That's it for this episode, and I'll see you guys next time. I'd like to thank my Patreons Alejandro, Kovian, Bay, Emerson, Kirijo, Polybius, and Yuan. If you want to become a Patreon, you can support me at patreon.com/devbird, where you can join my Discord, or you can just join the Discord in the link description below. And you can suggest videos or ask me questions, and I'll see you guys next time.